All right, now I'm returning here to the Crusades, and I did mention in that last video that they were wearing an emblem. Now, I was wrong. It was not. I pointed to my left shoulder, and I meant my right. It was actually the right shoulder that it's all on. So I was going to show that really quick. I did have an image of it. If you see here in this image, we've got these 4 different emblems, and some could be the Templars, some could be the Tectonians, are they the Tectonians? It seems like it in a way. And the whole Crusades deal, it wasn't just like one group. They did become a little bit like, and this one does this, this is like the Green Crusader, and this is the Red Crusader, and this one has the Black Cross, and this one has the Red Cross, and this one has the Green Cross. So they did do a little bit of different. And you notice how there's also some heads down here in the bottom. So anyway, it was not known as, hey, a peaceful time. So now I'm going to head back to the map, and I'll leave that here for the read. But this is just a few of them that were doing their travels to Jerusalem, to the Sepulchre, because apparently being near the object, was going to remove all, doubt of sin that they've ever committed, and just free them into purity, etc. So in this travel, I don't see boats on this map. They're not mentioning it. Were some getting, on boats? It doesn't really look like it, except for crossing between Italy and Greece. A lot was going on here. They were all going through Turkey. So they were dealing with the Turks at that zone, going through Constantinople, which is mentioned so much in this book already. It's good to know where it is on the map. And down they go. This is really, they didn't take the islands. They didn't take Greek islands. I'm not seeing any boats. So I'm hoping a few did, but it wasn't a time that they were doing much, except for they were leaving all the possessions behind or selling everything off dirt cheap, because oh no, it really was the end of the world. There was like doomsday going on, and Christ was going to reappear in Jerusalem. So a lot of people thought it was the end of the world, and so they're like, well, we don't need our possessions any longer. We just need God. We have to be close to God by the end, so get our foot into heaven. And so here they are crossing there to get their foot into heaven. And according to the book, it was like 6 million of them traveling, not all at once, various times, but a lot of people. And were they all 6 million going, or were they just wearing the badge on their arm? They could have just said, hey, I'm staying in France and I'll wear the badge and make all the others feel like cowards or dissenters. They're not joining our team, our team of religion. But property was going dirt cheap. We discovered that the Normandy, that I believe it was Robert, Duke of Normandy, literally mortgaged off Normandy to go. And with that mortgage, I think it was something like 10,000 or 14,000 equivalent dollars of the time, in coins, whatever it was. But yeah, very cheap. So he gave that off to his brother, so he mortgaged it off. So it was really a ridiculous, get rid of my castle, I'm leaving, I don't care the price. All right. And that was the rich and the poor. Okay, so in continuance, and I know some of these stanzas and paragraphs that they don't really make sense, but then other ones make a lot of sense. So it's a very discordant book, I know, but that is the way history was. It was discordant, and apparently maybe 200, 300 years ago this would be far more understandable to people. But all the hospitaliers did not embrace the new institution. The most ancient, so well known by the appellation of the Knights of St. Hilarius, refused to take the vow of chastity, and separated from the rest, who formerly belonged to the same order, and were subject to the same Grand Master. They pledged themselves, however, in the imitation of the others, to devote their lives to the defence of the Holy City. Besides their vows of charity and obedience, they swore an eternal promptitude to fight the enemies of Christianity, distinguishing themselves from their former brethren by a green cross, and like them rendered signal services to their kings, to the people, and religion. Louis the Young, on his return from Palestine, brought some of them with him into France to exercise their charitable functions, for which purpose he gave them the superintendence and administration of the lazarets in his kingdom, and ceded them to the castle of Boigny, near Orleans, which from that time became their chief place of residence, the splendour of the order being greatly diminished by the misfortunes of the times. Pope Innocent VIII undertook to suppress it, and to unite it together with its possessions, to the order of Saint John of Jerusalem. But all his bulls for that purpose, declared abusive by a decree of Parliament, were revoked by the Popes Pius IV and Pius V. It was not, however, until the reigns of Henry IV and Louis XIV that by the protection of those monarchs the Knights of St. Hilarius were restored to their primitive splendour. Pope Pius V united them to the order of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, which had been recently instituted at the instance of the French king. They then assumed, with their double title, a double cross. A double cross of gold with 8 points, and a fleur-de-lis, 4 fleur-de-lises, with the image of the Blessed Virgin in the middle. Okay, so the example of the Knights Hospitaliers was followed by many others. Hugh de Payens, Geoffrey de Saint-Aldemar, and 7 other French gentlemen, moved to the dangers. Oh my gosh, they were moved by the dangers which the pilgrims were exposed on their return to Jerusalem. They formed a little society amongst themselves for the purpose of escorting them. They accompanied them on their road to Palestine, beyond the défilé of the mountains and the most dangerous passes, and they met them at the same place on their return. This was a first example, a simple association, but by the sanction of the Council of Troy, it became a religious and military order. So in a way, they're like bodyguards on the trail, help me out, help me out. Saint Bernard prescribed rules for it and gave it the white habit with a red cross. The most illustrious princes and nobles fought under its banners. They were called Templars, or Knights of the Temple, because King Baldwin had assigned them apartments in his palace that was situated near the temple. In a short time, these knights, I always wondered how they were named, but yes, these knights became so powerful that their wealth exceeded that of the most opulent monarchs. But these riches, the glorious reward of merit, proved the cause of their ruin. The establishment of the Teutonic Knights, not tectonic, but they were Teutonic, took place soon after that of the Templars. This new order derived its true origin from the siege of Saint John of Acre. The German soldiers, when either sick or wounded, could not procure relief on account of their inability to speak a language that was understood. Some gentlemen from Bremen and Lübeck, touched with pity at the misfortunes of their countrymen, made a large tent with the sails of their ships, whither they conveyed such of their acquaintance as stood in need of relief, and attended them with great care and kindness. Being speedily joined by 40 noblemen of the same nation, they formed themselves into a religious and military order, which was sanctioned and confirmed by Pope Celestine III. They were called Teutonic Knights of Sainte Marie, from the name of a hospital which a rich German had formerly built at Jerusalem for the reception of the sick poor of his own country. Their habit was white with a black cross. They followed the rules of St. Augustine, took the same vows as the Hospitaliers and Templars, and observed the same military discipline as the latter. Before they assumed the habit, they were obliged to swear that they were descended from German parents and born noble. In 1108, during the transactions of the East, Philip was bullied. He was nothing of bully Philip apparently. No, he was busily employed, that's more like it, in extending his dominions. Profiting by the superstitious rage of the times, he united several large fiefs to the crown, and among others the country or lordship of Bourg, which Herpine sold to him for the purpose of procuring money to defray his expenses to the Holy Land. The kingdom enjoyed an uninterrupted state of tranquility for some years previous to the death of Philip, who expired at Melun in the 57th year of his age and the 50th of his reign. He was buried by his own desire at the Abbey of Saint-Benedict upon the Loire. Though Philip was generally despised by his subjects, and not without reason, yet he possessed many good qualities and excellent endowments. He was intrepid in the field, and when he applied to business, not unskilful in the cabinet. His generosity was extensive, his compassion strong, and the courteous affability of his demeanour coinciding with the extraordinary graces of his person. All those who had immediate access to him were apt to forget, in the manners of the man, the vices of the monarch. So he was still loved, but those near to him really adored him. Philip was twice married by his first wife Bertha, whom he barely repudiated, daughter to Florent, Count of Holland. He had Louis VI, surnamed from his corpulence the Gross, Henry, who died young, and a daughter named Constantia, who was first married to Hugh, Count of Troy, and afterwards to Bohemond I, Prince of Antioch. His children by the celebrated Bertrade of the illustrious house of Montfort were Philip, Count of Mantes and Lord of Melun, Fleury, Cecilia, who was twice married, first to Tancred. Excuse me, I lost my throat, my voice. Stop. Yes, married first to Tancred. That's a good name, isn't it? Tancred. Nephew to Bohemond, and next to Pont de Toulouse, Count of Tripoli, and Eustacia, wife to John, Count of Etampes. Several monastic orders were instituted during this reign. That of Chartreux, Carthufin, was founded in 1086 by Bruno, a native of Cologne, who was first a canon of the Church of Saint Cunibert, afterwards of Notre Dame at Rheims, the most learned theologian of the age. A desire of perfecting himself in the study of divinity induced him to retire to a solitary retreat in Dauphiné called Chartreuse, whence the order took its name. He was followed thither by 6 of his companions, who joined him in his studies and acts of devotion. They led a life of the greatest austerity. Oh my gosh, they wore sackcloth next to their skin. That's very uncomfortable. Seldom spoke to each other, took nothing but bread and water on Wednesday and Friday in every week, wine and vegetables on Tuesday and Saturday, cheese on Thursday, and a small portion of fish on Sunday and on festivals. Okay, I know this about the sackcloth because I was in a small movie in Germany, and it was De Johannes Passion, and I had to wear sackcloth for about 2.5 months. So I know it. It is very uncomfortable. All right. They were all bled 5 times a year and shaved only 6. No novicates were admitted under 20. Now, when I say they were all bled, I believe that was some sort of a bloodletting scene. They had to shed blood at one point 5 times a year. And they were shaved only 6, so they had to keep bald all the time. No novicates were admitted under 20, as they were precluded from speaking. They were furnished with parchment, pens, and ink in order to transcribe passages from books of divinity. The founder of the order, having been invited to assist the Pope, refused the bishopric of Reggio and died in Calabria at his monastery of Squillace, which had been founded by Roger, Count of Sicily. The Abbey of Melem in the Diocese of Langres had been founded 25 years by Abbot Robert, when an evident relaxation of discipline induced the pious founder with 20 of his monks to retire in the deserts of Citeaux, 5 leagues from Dijon. The Viscount of Beaune having given them a part of the forest, they cleared away the trees and erected a number of wooden cells, in which they passed 10 or 12 years in the exercise of those austerities in which had been originally practiced by the Saint Benedict. As they had received no novices during this time, they began to dread the extinction of their order, when they were joined in 1090 by Bernard, a gentleman of Burgundy, of the illustrious house of Chatillon, a man of strong sense and superior eloquence. After this ascension, the society flourished extremely, and the sanctity of its members afforded some degree of excuse for the prodigality of its benefactors. It was soon enabled to erect the 4 celebrated abbeys of La Ferte, Potigny, Clairvaux, and Morimond for the maids of Citeaux, or Cistercian, or they're called Cistercian nuns. The order took its name from the place where it was established, but of late it has been generally distinguished by the title of Bernardines. The Abbey of Fontevraud in the Diocese of Poitiers was founded about the same time by Robert de Abrifel, a man of genius and a great orator. He was always followed by a multitude of people of both sexes, who flocked together in order to profit, by his pious instructions. They really loved him. But as this singular mode of preaching the gospel gave rise to calumnious reports, it being said that Robert, in order to put his virtue to the proof, constantly slept between 2 of his female pupils. He resolved to lead his followers into some retired spot where a separate residence might be established for either sex. He accordingly fixed on Fontevraud for this purpose, where he established 2 monasteries subject to the rules of Saint Benedict, one for women who were entrusted with sovereign authority, and the other for men who were entirely dependent on the abbeys. Robert set for the example of obedience to his fair sisters, and always called himself steward or agent, homme d'affaires, to the nuns. This order of Fontevraud was the first over which a woman presided. So here is the first coming out of the name Homme d'Affaires, and here he is sleeping between two of his pupils, making all of these orders. This is the women on this side of the mansion and the men on that side on their mansion. So it was all giving him a little extra there. Anyway, so at 1108, Louis VI, and he is surnamed the Gros, and I'm not sure why, and maybe we will get into why this is. Though Louis had already been crowned on his association to the throne, the custom of the realm required him to undergo that ceremony a second time. On his accession, yes, I had started it again, I was just checking, on his accession to the sole authority of the kingdom. It was accordingly performed at Orléans by D'Imbert, Archbishop of Sens, on account of schism, which, well, they will call it a schism, which prevailed in the church of Rheims, where the princes of the Capetian race, except Robert, had hitherto been crowned. Rodolphe, also known as Rudolph, had been elected by the clergy of Rheims and had taken possession of the archiepiscopal dignity without waiting for the consent of Philip, who, in order to punish him for his presumption, had nominated another prelate named Gervais. Louis refused to be anointed by the first because, in conformity to the decrees of the popes and of the Council of Clermont, he refused to do homage to the king, nor would he suffer the last to perform that ceremony, because his authority was not universally acknowledged. Rodolphe had the presumption to oppose his coronation, under the pretext that it must be performed in his metropolitan church, and he thought by this opposition to engage the king to abandon his rival. But Yves de Chartres undertook to promote his reconciliation with Louis, and that monarch consented to suffer the archbishop to pay his respects to him at Orléans, and to attend the assembly which he had ordered to be convened in that city. Here the grand question of investiture was discussed. The whole kingdom was unanimous in rejecting the arrogant pretensions of the foreign pontiff, the foreign sovereign pontiff, and in supporting it didn't say foreign, it just said arrogant pretensions of the sovereign pontiff, didn't say foreign, and supporting the opinion of Saint Augustine that the church, holding its temporalities of the king, could not possibly possess them independent of him. Thus all the members of the assembly conjured the king not to confirm the election of the archbishop till he had done homage. Rodolphe, finding it in vain to resist, at length complied, and submitted to the required mark of subjection. When Louis had settled this important affair, he turned his thoughts towards the correction of those internal abuses which sprang from the turbulent disposition of the numerous and powerful vassals of the crown. The royal authority, indeed, was chiefly confined to Paris, Compiègne, Melun, Étampes, Orléans, Bourges, and some other places of little consequence, and many of the nobles were able to bring a more formidable army into the field than the king himself. My gosh, they're stronger than the king, to whom they paid a vain and sterile homage, while they exercised a despotic sway within their own territories and assumed almost every mark of sovereignty. So they really want to think of themselves as king. But the skill and courage of Louis were successfully exerted in repressing the inroads and curtailing the power of these dangerous subjects. He reduced numbers of them to submission, destroying their castles and confiscating their possessions. Among these was his brother Philip, Count of Mantes. Okay, and this is one for the coders. We have AD 1110. But the attention of Louis was soon called to oppose the increasing power of a more formidable enemy. This was Henry I, King of England, who had usurped the Duchy of Normandy to the prejudice of his brother Robert, and compelled the Duke of Brittany to pay him homage. The French perceived now it was too late the fault they had committed in not opposing the conquests of William I, and they accordingly took up arms to repress the dangerous encroachments of a power that threatened to destroy their own. From this period to the reign of Charles VII, there was a continual succession of war and peace between France and England. During that time, more than 120 treaties were concluded, which were all broken almost as soon as they were signed. The subject of the first dispute between them was the fortress of Gifford, situated on the frontier of France and Normandy. It had been agreed that it should be put into possession of a nobleman, who should not cede it either to an Englishman, a Norman, or a Frenchman, or in case it should fall under the power either of France or England, the fortifications should be razed within the space of 40 days. I think when they say razed like that, they mean destroyed, and not fall into anyone's hands. The governor here we are with the governor, either seduced by a bribe or intimidated by threats, surrendered the place to the King of England. Louis, the moment he was apprised of this circumstance, sent a messenger to the English monarch, desiring he would comply with the terms of the agreement. In vain, however, he did urge his request. In vain, however, did he urge his request. It was rejected by Henry, who, to his proposal of deciding the dispute by single combat, replied that if victorious he could but keep a place he already possessed without fighting, and that the King of France hazarded his life, indeed, to obtain an important acquisition, while his own would be staked against nothing. A battle was the consequence of this refusal, in which the Normans were defeated and compelled to retreat to Meulan. Henry, in return, endeavoured to excite an insurrection in France, that the king's attention might be confined to his own dominions. The most formidable of the insurgents was Theobald, Count of Blois, Chartres, and Champagne. Enraged with Louis for having refused him permission to erect a fort on a site of the crown, he entered into a league with the Count of Poitiers, the Duke of Burgundy, and several other of the king's vassals, and made a powerful diversion in favour of the English monarch. So new loyalty for England. Louis, whose activity was ever equal to his courage, levied an army with the utmost expedition, and, assisted by Robert, Count of Flanders, one of the bravest warriors of the age, marched to attack the rebels. The Count of Blois was defeated in 3 different engagements, the first at Meaux, the second near Lagny, and the third at a league from Puisay. Now Henry, in the meantime, having remained in the capital of Normandy, a passive spectator of the slaughter of his allies, Louis sent a detachment to the very gates of Rouen, whose devastations forced the English monarch to take to the field. Well, to take the field. They didn't say to take to the field. That's probably later English, but yes, to take the field mean go to battle right now. Get there. After a few trifling skirmishes in which Henry had the advantage, a treaty of peace was concluded between the 2 monarchs, in which all the rebels were included. The principal condition was that William, the only son of Henry, should do homage to Louis in the place of his father for the Duchy of Normandy, in consequence of which the castle of Gifford was ceded to him. All right, 1112 to 1114. No sooner was this war terminated than Theobald, Count of Blois, again displayed the banners of revolt and compelled the king to make an incursion into his territories. But in this expedition he did not meet with his usual success, for, being taken by surprise, he sustained a defeat, and his loss was considerably aggravated by the death of Robert, Count of Flanders, who was thrown from his horse and trampled to death. The King of England was accused of being the instigator of these insurrections, and Louis profited by the favourable disposition of Fulk V, Count of Anjou, to retaliate the injury. This nobleman had married Sibylla, the only daughter of Anjou, to retaliate the injury. All right. I might have repeated that one, but anyway. This noble, it was married to Sibylla, the only daughter of Helique. Is it Helique or Heli? Heli. Helie. Of Heli, Count of Maine. And by the death of his father-in-law, he had acquired possession of that county, won by the solicitations of the court of France, and assured Yes, assured of effectual support. He refused to do homage to Henry for his new domain, and engaged several noblemen to espouse his cause, particularly Robert de Belesme and Hugh de Medavide. Henri, alarmed at this powerful confederacy, repaired to the continent, and took every method which prudence could suggest to avert the impending storm. So Henry's getting worried, heading back to England. Well, no, actually, he might have been in England. He says repaired to the continent. He might be back in France now. So during 2 years, yes, which he passed in Normandy, he was continually engaged either in wars or negotiations. At length, finding that all his endeavours to suppress the insurrections were in vain, he fought to assure and allure the Count of Anjou by a proposal of marriage between his own son William, who was the heir apparent to his dominions, and the youngest daughter of Fulk. This temptation proved too strong to be resisted. The Count, who had before contracted his daughter to William, the son of Duke Robert, now broke that contract on pretence of their consanguinity, and immediately affianced her sister to the son of Henry, who stood exactly in the same degree of relation to her. The King of England formed a second alliance, which rendered him still more formidable to the French, by grandson Conan IV, was father to Constantia, who had by Guy, Count of Thouars, Ali, wife to Peter of Dreux, great-grandson to Louis the Gros. It was through this alliance that the Duchy of Brittany became, at a subsequent period, reunited to the crown, from which he has never since been separated. All right, this was in 1116. About this time, Louis married Adelaide, daughter of Humbert, Count of Maurienne and Savoy. It also says 1115, so those marriages around in there, if you're looking up the genealogy exact. Count of Maurienne and Savoy. The amiable qualities of this princess endeared her to the nobility, and her good sense and discretion contributed to smooth the rugged path which Louis, throughout his reign, had destined to tread. And he was destined to tread. Okay. The relative situation of the French and English monarchs and the contrariety of their interests were such at this period as to render the preservation of tranquillity between them a matter of extreme difficulty. The turbulence of their vassals afforded frequent opportunities for the open display of that enmity with which they were mutually impressed. When a French nobleman had any subject for discontent, he applied for support to Henry, and if a Norman wished to encourage sedition, in Louis he was sure to find a ready protector. In this state of mind, the French monarch listened with pleasure to the supplicating voice of a young prince, who, having in vain attempted to rouse the compassion of other monarchs, now sought shelter and support in the court of France. This prince was whose filial piety implored the humanity of Louis to procure the liberty of his father, a prisoner to his brother Henry. The King of France did not long hesitate to comply with the request. Recommended by the powerful motives of pity and interest, he advised William to engage the inclinations of the nobles of Normandy, and particularly to attach to his cause the Counts of Flanders and Anjou. The negotiation of the young prince was successful, but when the treaty was about to be signed by the heads of the confederacy, the Count of Anjou refused to confirm his engagement unless the king would re-establish him to the office of Grand Seneschal of Europe. Of France. That's my takeover of Europe. Just give it to me. Of France, which had been hereditary in his family from the reign of Lothair. We have already had occasion to observe that this office was nearly the same as that of Grand Maître d'Hôtel with regard to the royal household, as that of constable in the time of war. And as that of Count of the Palace in the administration of justice. The chief vassals of the crown resided so little at court that it was impossible for the Counts of Anjou to perform all the duties annexed to the office of seneschal. For this reason, they appointed a substitute, who acted in their name. The custom, indeed, of thus converting the great offices of the crown into fiefs was not unfrequent. The office of seneschal had been long filled by the Garlands, ministers and favourites of Louis the Gros. These noblemen, proud of the protection of their sovereign, took advantage of the defection of the Counts of Anjou to refuse them that homage which it was, usual to pay. And it was to pay to the proprietors of an hereditary office, and which gave it to the complexion and nature of a fief. The present count at first took no notice of this mark of disrespect, but beginning to fear that his right would at length be forfeited, he took advantage of the opportunity that now presented itself to procure a confirmation of it. This Louis, who wanted his assistance, could not refuse, and William de Garland accordingly did homage to him for the office, and after Stephen his brother, who, although a deacon, succeeded him in a place which gave him the command of armies and the power of inflicting capital punishments, a circumstance hitherto unexampled. All right, so the Anjou one did not really want to go all the time, probably didn't want to go to the north, and that's where the Pairs are, and that's pretty much down there near Marseille, near over there to Béziers, where it says Saint-Gilles on this map. It's in that area. So you can kind of understand he didn't want to, if that was what was going on. All right. So we now have inflicting capital punishments. All right, okay. Every preliminary being now settled, the plan of operations was immediately laid. It was agreed to enter Normandy in 3 different parts. The King of Almerie de Montfort, on the side of France, the Count of Flanders by the Pays de Caux, and the Count of Anjou on the side of Maine. But I'm not sure if that really was where the Count of Anjou lived, but definitely his ancestors are there. Because now they're saying on the side of Maine, and maybe that would be a river up there. So maybe he was north. He was just lazy and didn't want to see the king. Louis then sent to demand of the King of England, oh gosh, the liberty of Duke Robert. And on the refusal of Henry, war was declared. So he didn't get his Robert, and so there's war. The armies of the Confederates immediately began their march, and were joined by a great number of the Norman nobility and gentry, whom William had engaged to espouse his cause. The chief of these were William de Gournay, Stephen, Count of Aumade, Henri, Count of Eu, Eustache de Breteuil, Richard de l'Aigle, Renaud de Balwell, and Robert de Neuburg, or Neuburg. They all took up arms in favour of the young prince, and proclaimed him Duke of Normandy. So he has a whole bunch of supporters. The king, in the meantime, took Andalais by surprise, seized Gué-Nicef, and a very important fortress on the river Epte, and made himself master of the town Aigle. The Count of Flanders likewise advanced into Upper Normandy, where he laid waste the country with fire and sword. Henry sent him word that if he did not discontinue his devastations, he would himself carry desolation to the gates of Brugge. The Count replied that he would save him the trouble of so long a journey. He accordingly marched straight to Rouen, where Henry was, and sent that monarch a formal challenge to meet him in the field. But this being declined, and the town being too strong to be easily reduced, he contented himself with burning the suburbs, and then retired. The Count of Anjou, in the meantime, laid siege to Alençon, and took it in the presence of Henry and the Count of Champagne, who had hastened to its relief. Amaury de Montfort engaged the governor of Evreux to surrender that town with its castle, which were entrusted to the care of Philip and Fleury, brothers to Louis. No augmentation of danger, however, could depress the mind of Henry, who exerted his wonted courage to extricate himself from his difficulties, which he had at length effected, not by pusillanimous confessions, but by vigorous resistance. Hitherto he had acted chiefly on the defensive, as from the superior force of the confederated princes. He had no hopes of success from the adoption of a contrary line of conduct, and he thought it possible that some favourable change might take place, and that his attempts to sow division amongst his enemies might finally succeed. Nor was he deceived in his conjectures. Baldwin, Count of Flanders, one of his most formidable adversaries, received a wound at the attack of the castle of Bourg, in the Pays de Caux, of which he soon after expired. But the defection of the Count of Anjou was a circumstance of much greater importance to the King of England, and gave a more fatal blow to the interests of the French monarch. That nobleman, seduced by the bribes of Henry, violated those solemn oaths by which he was attached to Louis, as a vassal, as an officer of the crown, and as an ally, and declared for his rival. Okay. The contest being now rendered more equal, Henry determined to take the field, and having received intelligence that Louis had formed a plan for surprising the castle of Noyon near Andilay, he marched to the relief of that place, and took the King of France by surprise on the plain of Brennéville. A sharp conflict immediately ensued, in which Prince William, the son of Duke Robert, who led the vanguard of the French, displayed the greatest bravery. He broke through the first ranks of the English, and penetrated to the spot where his uncle was posted, whose life was in imminent danger, having received a wound on the head from William Crispon, a gallant Norman officer, who had followed the fortunes of the young prince. The French, however, thinking the victory was already gained, broke their ranks in search of plunder, while Henry, profiting by their confusion, restored order to his troops, and attacked the enemy with irresistible fury. The whole army fled with precipitation, William being, unhorsed. He was unhorsed. Made his escape with difficulty, and Louis himself had nearly been taken prisoner. It is said that an Englishman, seizing the bridle of his horse, exclaimed, "The king is taken." "Do not you know," replied that prince, smiling, "that at chiefs the king is never taken?" Okay. At the same time aiming a blow at him with his sabre, which laid him dead at his feet. He then galloped towards a forest, where he wandered about for a considerable time, when he met with a woman. Oh, I love Woman in the Forest. This is like a video game. Who conducted him to Andilay. So I believe the king is still alive, and he killed someone at that point. This skirmish was rendered famous by the dignity of the combatants, 2 kings, 2 princes, and many noblemen of the first rank being engaged in it. The slaughter was trifling, only 3 men being slain. This was partly owing to the heavy armor which was worn by the cavalry in those times. Are you kidding? that's pretty amazing compared to the other wars from before. Yay, oh my gosh. And partly to the earnest desire of making prisoners in order to enrich themselves in their ransom. So in 1117 through 1119, Louis, finding himself unable to wrest Normandy from the king by force of arms, had recourse to the dangerous expedient of making application to the spiritual power of affording the ecclesiastics a specious pretense for interposing in the temporal concerns of princes. He prevailed upon Pope Calixtus II, who was then in France, to convene a general council at Rheims, whither he carried William the young Norman prince, and, having presented him to the assembly, expatiated largely on the manifest usurpation and flagrant injustice of the English monarch, craved the assistance of the Church for reinflating the true heir in his dominions, and represented the enormity of detaining in captivity so valiant a prince as Robert, one of the most distinguished champions of the crusade, who by his powerful exertions, they are just exertions, I guess so, his powerful exertions against the infidels, was placed under the immediate protection of the apostolic see. I know I've gone on a long time on this one, but I do believe they finally have armor, and the two kings fought in that one, and I believe they're both still alive. So we're going to stop this and go on until another time.